Hi, in this video I'll take a look at the new Mark III generation of Arturia's large format MIDI controllers, the more feature-rich but more expensive Keylab Mark III versus the more affordable Keylab Essential Mark III. Both are MIDI controllers, meaning they don't make any sounds on their own, but both can control external hardware synths or software instruments on your computer using templates you can customize. Both have a tight built-in integration with Analog Lab V and with Arturia's software instruments, and both also have integrations with popular DAWs like Ableton Live, Logic, and others. In this video, I'll take a look at what they can do, how they're similar and different, and also discuss pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure, Arturia sent me these controllers. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview to get the lay of the land. Now, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to call the Keylab Mark III just Keylab and stick with Essential for the Keylab Essential Mark III. Both controllers come in 4 and 5 octave versions, and Essential also has an 88 key version, not currently available for Keylab. There are black versions of both. Both controllers can work in one of 3 different modes or programs, as they're called here. Arturia for when you want to work with Arturia software, DAW when you want to work with a digital audio workstation, and then another user template mode where you can configure the knobs, buttons, faders, everything to send out MIDI commands that are compatible with a hardware or software synth. Keylab Essential also supports these 3 modes. Generally speaking, Keylab is better than Essential in every way except for 2 major things. Keylab costs more than twice than Essential, and Keylab, while it definitely has a more premium build, real wood sides, and more features, it is much heavier and therefore not as easy to carry around as Essential. Both have a built-in Arpeggiator chord node and scale modes that will work independently of any software or hardware you use them with, though Keylab has an extended feature set for each of those. Let's start with the main way you interact with these, and that's the Keybed. Both are synth action, but Keylab has more bounce and a more premium feel compared to Essential, which is a bit more spongy and less bouncy, I guess. Both keybeds are velocity sensitive. Keylab does feel better in that respect too. Slightly more sensitive. Keylab's keybed also has aftertouch, which Essential does not. This is channel aftertouch though, not polyphonic aftertouch, so the timbre of all held notes will change regardless of the key you apply pressure to. The next big difference between the two is the larger color screen on Keylab with fairly good viewing angles versus the monochrome screen on Essential with not so great viewing angles. Both, by the way, are night and day better than the screens on the previous Mark II versions, but certainly this screen is a big improvement in 2 ways. First, when you're working with Analog Lab, then it's nice to see the preview of whatever instrument it is you're playing. And then another difference related to the screen is that Keylab has 8 contextual screen buttons as opposed to only 4 contextual screen buttons on Essential. That means you can control up to 8 parameters at a time. So for example, if I go into the Arpeggiator, long press, you'll see I have immediate access to each of these parameters, as opposed to Essential where you need to tab between groups of 4 parameters at a time. The next important difference between the two is the touch sensitivity of these controls, of the knobs and buttons. So let's go back into DAW mode and take a look at one of Live's instruments. On Essential, you need to move the knob or fader to see what it does, meaning you'll also be changing its value at least slightly in the case of knobs, and potentially more in the case of faders, depending on their pickup mode. Whereas with touch-sensitive controls, you can touch an encoder and see its value before you change it. Same goes for the faders, though I noticed not every touch shows up. By the way, if you want to avoid major changes to parameters when you're using the faders, set your DAW to pickup or scale mode as opposed to immediate. The encoders on both, by the way, are endless encoders, which is great. In terms of physical feel, they feel very similar to me. Maybe these are a little bit more sturdy, and maybe there's a little bit more wobble here, but not a big difference, I think, in terms of the encoders. The faders, though, do have a larger travel distance on Keylab Mark III as opposed to Essential Mark III. The faders here, though, feel great regardless. Moving on, another visibly obvious difference between the two is the 12 physical pads on Keylab versus only 8 pads on Essential. With only 2 banks of pads on Essential, bank A and bank B, versus 4 banks of pads and a DAW mode in Ableton Live, but at least 4 banks of 12 pads on Keylab. That means controlling more drums when you're playing a drum-based instrument, and a bigger clip view in Live. The pads on both are velocity and pressure sensitive, and velocity sensitivity on both seems excellent. I'm no finger drummer, but both feel good to me. Maybe the pads on Essential are a little bit less sensitive, but I actually like their feel more. They have a bit more meat in them. The pads on both are pressure sensitive, and I think that pressure sensitivity is excellent on both. The pads are RGB pads on both, which is very helpful when you're navigating around the Ableton Live grid, though you see a larger view into the grid here compared to the view on Essential. Then in terms of other physical controls, the pitch and mod wheel on Keylab feel more premium. They're made of aluminum as opposed to the wheels on Essential, which are plastic, but they don't feel bad. And then the buttons here are more firm and clicky, as opposed to the rubbery feel of the buttons here. But overall, I think these are just fine. And then the program button is in a more useful location, I think, here. If you're going to move a lot between Arturia mode and DAW mode or user mode, this is more convenient than the program mode here, which also requires 2 clicks to move between modes. I think they should add at least an option to toggle between modes when you press this button a few times. Anyway, so those are the physical differences between the two. Let's take a look under the hood because there are differences there too. Let's start with the Arpeggiator. Like I mentioned, there are a few basic features which are identical on both, and then a few extra features on Keylab. So let's start with the features that are identical, and you'll see them here on these 2 pages, and then here on this 1 page. I'll show them over here because it's easier to reach, but these features exist on both. There's an order option with the usual suspect options, time division relative to the master tempo, gate length, octaves, swing, overall tempo if it's not synced, and then you can also sync this to your DAW or to an external clock source. So that's it for the similarities. And then on Keylab, you have access to a whole second page of parameters with interesting generative style randomization options. So these are 7 parameters that don't exist here. Let's quickly go through them. Trig is the probability that a note will be played. And then skip will skip notes in a pattern without leaving a blank space. Division is bipolar and will either randomly speed up or slow down the pattern, but stay in sync with the tempo. Octave will randomly transpose a single note. This one is bipolar too, so a positive value will transpose up and a negative value will transpose down. Gate is a bipolar randomization of note length. Ratchet increases the probability that a note will play twice. And velocity is a bipolar randomization of velocity. And then the little dice button will just randomize everything. If you're not happy, you can always roll the dice again. This may become an addicting habit, so be careful. And a long press will reset things back to normal. Okay, let's move on and talk about the chord modes. Here too, you've got basic features on Essential and then more advanced features on Keylab. So on Essential, a long press on chord will show you the options. You can either scroll between a few built-in chords, or program a user chord. So a long press on chord and let's say program this. So that's as far as chords go on Essential. And then you've got the same preset chord options over here. And you can also record your own chord, but there are a few additional options here. So voicing, we'll add a bass note. Spread will spread the chord to an extreme, and we'll also let you create velocity-based spreads and aftertouch-based spreads. So that's interesting. And then strum will, as expected, strum the chord, and this works with spreads or voicings as well. So that's the strum speed, and then there are a few strum types. So pretty nifty generative style features here as well. And then both keyboards also support various scales, meaning locking the keys into one of several set scales so you can't play any wrong notes. You long press the button to choose the scale. And there are several options here, both for root note and the actual scale itself. And then same deal here. So for example, this is, let's go for major, which is easy, just the white notes, starting with a root of C. So if I play any black keys, they'll be rounded to the nearest white key. And you can see the notes in the scale as you choose the different options. So this certainly isn't a major scale, even though I'm only playing the white notes. So nice scale features on both, and Keylab has the one additional option of letting you set your own custom scale. Moving on, hold mode is a little bit different between the two. Here on Essential, hold mode behaves like it does on the Arpeggiator. So every new note you play, or group of notes, will replace the previously held note. This, whether the Arpeggiator is running or not. Here, hold behaves kind of like a sustain pedal outside the Arpeggiator mode. So if you've got an ARP mode, it'll hold it as you expect. But without the Arpeggiator on, it behaves like a sustain pedal. You can, of course, plug a sustain pedal in both if you want. In terms of connectivity, both keyboards can be powered by USB-C alone. Both have a MIDI output and a control jack for expression or sustain. Keylab adds on top of that 2 more control jack inputs and a MIDI input. And you can also power Keylab using an external power supply, which is not included. Both have transpose buttons and a MIDI button to let you choose which MIDI channel you're sending out notes on. Okay, let's move on and dive a little bit deeper into programs. Remember, both can let you control either your DAW, Arturia software, or create your own user templates. Let's start with Arturia mode, or controlling Arturia software. This applies both to Analog Lab and to Arturia's individual synths if you own them. Let's start with Analog Lab Pro. Both keyboards come with Analog Lab Pro with over 2,000 presets from Arturia's V Collection synths. Note that you don't get the individual software synths, but rather Analog Lab, which can play presets that come from these synths. The idea is that you use the controller to quickly browse between presets and find the ones that you like. You can do that, obviously, in the software as well. Here, too, there's a difference in functionality between the two controllers besides the nice color screen. Let's start with Essential. You can flip through presets if you want. And it'll take a while because it comes with 2,000 of them, but you can filter down by types. So say choose bass and then different subtypes within bass. And then you'll be browsing just between that type of preset. You can also quickly scroll through presets and then press the screen encoder when you want to load one. And you can also favorite presets to find them later. You also have the 9 encoders and faders to control preset parameters. And this is, of course, a lot of the charm of the combination between Analog Lab and the hardware controllers. And you can also create splits, if you like, directly from the controller. So a long press will let me load something into part 2. And now I've got 2 instruments at once, and I can long press to edit each of the parts to set, say, a split point. So now I've got part 2 here, part 1 here, 2 different sounds, and there's additional functionality here to fine-tune the different parts. Once you've got everything set up, you can use this button to choose what these controls control. So now I'm controlling part 1, and now part 2. And then when I press this again, I control parameters that are common to both. So for example, the brightness of both, or say reverb. This, by the way, is kind of like a mini Astrolab in terms of its capabilities, with the only caveat, of course, that you need to have a computer around. So that's what you can do on Essential. On Keylab, you can do all of the above, plus a bit more, of course. So browsing through presets will show you this nice preview of the engine powering the preset. By the way, on both going up and down presets will immediately load the preset, whereas browsing with the encoder won't load the patch until you press the encoder. Anyway, here, beside browsing by type, you can also browse by instrument. You get a nice preview of the instrument. And again, once you choose one, then you'll only see presets from that instrument. Or I guess multis with it. And then you can also browse by genre or by banks. And you can filter each of these by liked presets. Here too, you can choose to control an individual part with the encoders and faders, or both, and you've got control of a few more part parameters that you don't on Essential. Then beside Analog Lab, you can also use these controllers directly with Arturia's software synths, whether standalone or in your DAW if you own the license to them, and Keylab MK3 comes bundled with quite a few good ones. Let's take, for example, Mini V4. Once you load it up, the encoders and faders are auto-mapped to the synth's parameters. Now, with both controllers, the knobs and faders are mapped to the synth's parameters. However, because the knobs and faders aren't touch sensitive here, then you have to turn the knob or move the fader before you see what it does. And it's hard to remember, obviously, what so many physical controls do. On Keylab, you can touch to preview a parameter and decide if you want to change it based on what it controls. Same deal here in terms of browsing. You can browse by type, genre, or bank, not by instrument, of course, because it's just the one instrument, and types are available here as well. Okay, let's move on and talk about DAW control mode. I'll talk about this in general and then get into some specifics regarding Ableton Live because there's an advanced integration there. In both controllers, you've got these 12 DAW control buttons. They're pretty much self-explanatory. Tap tempo, metronome, turning looping, on and off, on the timeline, moving around the timeline, undo and redo, quantizing any mistakes you made. And then in mixer mode, you control track levels with the faders, same on both, panning. I didn't see a way to control sends, by the way, at least not for Ableton Live. And then on both, the far right encoder and knob control the current track. So whatever track it is you're on, you've got control of its panning and level. You can move back and forth between tracks. It's a little bit different on both, but the functionality exists. And then there's one free contextual button here, which will arm tracks on or off. You can obviously also arm tracks here, as well as solo and mute tracks. And then let's take a look at some Ableton Live functionality. You can go up and down between scenes using the arrows here or the encoder here and launch a scene by pressing the encoder here or pressing this button here to launch an entire scene. And then you can navigate around the grid on both. And then as long as you're in DAW mode, you can launch clips or chord into empty clip slots. Same here, only in a 4x2 grid as opposed to a 4x3 grid. And then for Ableton Live, you've got device mode on both. Again, you don't know what you're controlling here until you actually move the parameter and change it. And then on Keylab, touch sensitivity is great because you can see what it is you're about to control before you control it. One thing that I saw that Essential is better in this respect is that you can control, depending on the device, if it has those parameters, up to 16 parameters on Keylab, whereas on Essential, you can swap between banks if that track has enough banks. Let's say, go into this one. So on this track, we've got a device with enough parameters so that we can control 32 parameters at a time, 16 per bank. So take that, Keylab MK3, or maybe an idea for a firmware update. And then at least for Ableton Live, like I mentioned earlier, you only get to control 8 drums in total here because the other bank is a clip launching bank. Whereas on Keylab, beside the clip launching bank, you've got 4 banks of drum controls. So not just 12, but also the next bank for a total of 16 or even more drums if they're programmed into the kit. So that's it for control of Ableton Live. For control of other DAWs, check the documentation. Let's move on to the third program or device mode, which is the user templates. So the idea here is that you can configure the pads, the faders, and the encoders to send out MIDI commands. On Keylab MK3, you can actually do that from within the controller itself. So you can set up a few of these templates and then go ahead and change what the encoders do, what the faders do, the pads, the various display buttons, pedals, wheels. So if you don't like the CC that the mod wheel is sending out, you can go ahead and edit that, or say control the encoders, turn touch sensitivity on or off if you want, control various encoder parameters, or edit the specific encoder. You can rename each encoder so you don't need to remember what does what within your synth, assign it to the actual parameter that it's controlling. You've got controls or NRPNs, which is nice. You can change the CC, and same goes for the faders and the pads, both general settings, and on a per pad basis, change its color as you saw there, and even change the type from note to switch control to program change. So everything can be customized here. Speaking of which, you can also set global settings right here from the device. So you don't need a computer or control software to make any or all of these changes. For Keylab Essential, you can still create user templates and customize its settings, but you just need to do that using Arturia's MIDI Control Center software. It's pretty easy. You just select the control that you want to customize and edit its parameters. You can't name controls, unfortunately, which would have been nice. Same goes, by the way, for these buttons and for the pads. So everything's customizable, and device settings as well. You can change everything from MIDI Control Center, just not the Keybed itself. By the way, if you wanted, you could edit Keylab from the software as well. So you don't have to use the controller. For example, it's much more convenient to name controls here than it is from the controller. So I think you'll agree this is an excellent use of a control. Then finally, before the pros and cons, the content bundle between the two is different. If you tend to dismiss content bundles, don't. Both get 2,000 excellent presets with Analog Lab, but Keylab MK3 gets, among others, an augmented instrument, the Mini V, the full synth. So besides just generic macro controls, you can actually go in and edit each synth parameter, as well as Piano V, which I think is an excellent piano. So let's sum up the pros and cons for these controllers, both with respect to each other and versus the competition. Pros for Essential Mark III are that it's cheaper, and yes, it also feels that way, but it's also lighter, making it more portable, and the fact that it's relatively inexpensive means you might feel less guilt throwing it into a bag and taking it on the go. On the other hand, while Keylab Mark III costs more than twice as much, it does kind of feel like you're getting what you pay for. Keylab has a much better build, a bigger and much better screen, a better feeling keybed with aftertouch, more pads, touch-sensitive encoders and faders, which I think is important, and it ticks way more feature boxes with additional capabilities, as I discussed in detail throughout this video. Then competitively, you'll find less expensive keybeds with fewer controls and more expensive ones with an even bigger screen or little screens so that you can see what each knob does as opposed to touching it or turning it. There are also alternatives with polyphonic aftertouch. Keylab Mark III only has channel aftertouch, and Essential doesn't have aftertouch at all. Neither of these controllers have track selection buttons. The Mark II did, by the way. So if you're using a DAW and that's important to you, to select tracks specifically as opposed to moving between tracks using the encoder or buttons, then that's missing here. Generally speaking, I'd say competitors to consider are the Novation controllers, which have a better integration with DAWs, especially Ableton Live, or controllers with onboard sequencing if that's important to you. These don't have any. And then if you use a lot of native instruments, software instruments, then its controllers have the best integration with that. So that's it for Keylab Mark III and Keylab Essential Mark III. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.